Good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar where we are looking at the impact of ChatGPT on knowledge work. And we're really excited to have a diverse group of panelists with us today, offering perspective on questions that I think we've all been thinking about as we've witnessed the advent of ChatGPT and just the huge progress that has been made with generative AI in just the last few weeks and months. My name is Chelsea Donahue. I work with the Kenan Institute, which is the thought leadership and outreach arm of the Kenan-Flagler Business School. We are focused on the impact of emerging tech on business strategies and really what that means for business leaders. So we thank you for joining us today for this discussion. With that, I will go ahead and quickly introduce our panelists, and we will dive right in. So we have Mark McNeely with us, who is a professor of marketing at Kenan-Flagler Business School and has really taken the lead at the business school with understanding not only the implications of ChatGPT for higher ed, but what this means for the business community as well. Mohammed is joining us from the School of Information and Library Sciences, where he is a professor and has spent his career really looking at the intersection of the social and technical. So this is just all his research has really all led to this understanding of how we're humans interacting with technology and working together. Thomas is a professor of philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill and is also the director of the AI project, which is really working on building collaboration across programs. So getting your computer science, your philosophy, your business folks all thinking about this together. And Phaedra is joining us from IBM. Very excited to have her here, where she is the global leader for trustworthy AI. So excited to have her joining us from industry. So with that, Phaedra, I'd love for you to kick it off. My first question for you is just understanding what it is that you've been doing at IBM and really how that's evolved in response to all the progress that's happened.
Oh, goodness, that's a big opening question. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this highly esteemed panel. I'm so pleased to be here talking about this important subject. So my job at IBM is twofold. So my job is to help our clients be more responsible curators of artificial intelligence, but it is also my job to train our own practitioners how to do this kind of work. And earnestly, we recognized long ago that earning trust in AI is not a technical problem. It's not a technical problem with a technical solution. It's a socio-technical problem, which means you really have to have a holistic approach. Holistic meaning people, process, tools, people, what is the right kind of culture that is required to curate AI responsibly? What are the right kinds of processes, AI governance, safeguard rails, and then tools and AI engineering frameworks. And earnestly, when we work with our clients to help them, what we're finding more often than not is actually culture is the most challenging, helping them, making sure they really approach the space with humility, open growth mindset, truly multidisciplinary teams. And I would say that is the hard part, multidisciplinary, that are diverse and inclusive in nature. So certainly with the advent of generative AI, not only is there a learning curve to understand the differences between foundation models and natural language processing, which has been out in the market proliferating for quite some time, but also considerations on what are the required safeguard rails, what are the use cases that are low risk, how should clients really be approaching the nature of this work. So that's, in a nutshell, how we're approaching it.
Mm-hmm. And now what are really some, I mean, in the past few weeks, what are some of the horror stories that are keeping you up at night, the things that are I mean, that I think everyone is it's amazing how this has consumed. If you're in the knowledge workspace, this is what you're thinking about. So what are some stories on your end that are really causing you to worry?
Well, the press has done, I think, a fantastic job with their coverage of this. Really, absolutely phenomenal. I think they've been crushing it. The New York Times reporter, mostly recently, Kevin Roose, talking about his conversation with a generative AI that was telling him to leave his wife and, expressing that it loved him and these kinds of things. But then there are plenty of other examples. I think the MIT Technology Review, they're one of my favorite publications for their coverage of the space. They talk not just about the challenges around large language models and what the unique risks are, but also other forms of generative AI, including AI that generates art. They did, fantastic coverage of stable diffusion, which I think was absolutely wonderful, highlighting some of the challenges with respect to the biased nature of the training data for those models. And it explains, why, for example, other AI apps that might use stable diffusion or training data from stable diffusion might be more prone to drawing women half dressed, as an example. So they did some great coverage to explain why that is happening and what's going on. Apart from generative AI, there's also plenty of fodder, including the reason why President Biden signed an executive order in February saying that all the AI models being used within the federal government have to be audited for equitable outcomes. And this is because of an expose with respect to an AI algorithm being used within the IRS that was making it such that Black taxpayers were being audited 3 to 5 times more often than white taxpayers. And again, back due to an algorithm. Or others where, for example, a police force in Spain had procured an AI model to help the police force determine the level of recidivism of domestic abusers, right? And the way that this AI model worked would be that, you put in the information about the spouse and it would run an algorithm and determine, like, spit out a score. And if the score was high enough, the police would send out a protective order, right? And it was only after 19 women were killed by their spouses that the model was taken down and it was audited to find out, like, what's happening, what's the nature of the bias behind this model. So again, there's plenty to keep us all up at night when thinking about, some of the unique risks. That being said, there's also an equal number of stories of, what are the opportunities of how we are continually using AI to augment human intelligence in truly delightful ways. I think that the challenge that we have, and what I bring to this panel in particular, this forum, is that we really need to approach educating on this space differently. Because if you're lucky enough to have a class in something like data and AI ethics, it's typically for those who self-categorize in a certain way as future machine learning scientists, computer scientists, data scientists, and not everybody else. Because indeed, in order to do this well, to do this correctly, we really need a wider variety of different kinds of human beings working on this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great segue into my question for you, Thomas, just how your research has led you to be asking questions about AI systems. And then as Phaedra said, that this does, it really starts to, it makes you think about what does it mean to be human? How can this amplify our thought, our creativity? So would love for you to speak to that.
Okay, so my own path towards it comes from just my main interests in philosophy, which is basically in the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mathematics. where you just try to understand how human language works, how we represent the world in thought and language, how all these different representations, like the ones we have in perception, relate to the ones we have that are more language-like, how all this works together to build, a human being, a person, an agent, and things like that. And so, so when I was in graduate school, I was part of this interdisciplinary center called the Center for the Study of Language and Information at Stanford, and that was a group of people that was mostly computer scientists, linguists, and philosophers who tried to, in part, build artificial systems that used, symbolic representations and build intelligent systems through symbol manipulation, basically, which was sort of the prominent paradigm at the time. So we're talking like the late 90s, something like that. And so that was built on the basis of this real discovery that you could understand mathematical reasoning as symbol manipulation, and just a couple of ways of manipulating symbols can give you insights into how mathematical reasoning worked. And the thought was that you could amplify this and build larger intelligent systems by, drawing on symbol manipulation techniques. And that, was very promising. And the thought was that, if you think about how you could possibly reverse engineer something like an intelligent system through something like this, then you could understand both the human mind as well as how you can build an artificial mind. That didn't really work out too well. I mean, there were advances made, but so the advances that are made these days are based on a different paradigm using neural networks, not symbol manipulation. But then when these advances became more prominent in the last couple of years, so I focused my attention more on that with the same purpose. You try to understand what lessons you can learn from the human mind to build an artificial mind or build an artificial intelligence systems, and the other way around. So that's how I got into this.
Mm-hmm. And then I know Phaedra touched on the ethical piece as far as some of your ethical applications you might take from philosophy. But what are I guess some of the other kind of frameworks or ways of thinking from philosophy that you're now applying to how you're thinking and making decisions about using AI?
So, okay, so there's different aspects to this. So there's the ethical aspect, which is extremely important, and that is a major topic. And then there's sort of the more understanding intelligence itself kind of topic, because it's unclear why human minds are intelligent. It's not completely understood how we do the amazing things that we do, and so you try to learn from artificial systems about the human mind and the other way around. And then the ethical aspect of it. So this is something that I'm also very concerned. So I teach a class on this regularly at UNC called AI and the Future of Humanity, which has as a large part covers ethical aspects, in particular bias and explainability. So so one of the main issues about AI bias that can arise from a number of different sources, and then also the issue that if you have a model that gives you a certain output, you don't necessarily get an explanation about why that happened. So this is partly related to the paradigm of building these models as neural networks. You would have explainability more easily if you use the other paradigm that didn't work out so well so far.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And Mohammed, I know your explainability is obviously one of the huge limitations, and is in getting adoption from people is a huge obstacle. But if you could talk a little bit about what else, I mean, in your research is kind of telling us about what we need to be aware of as far as your kind of inherent issues that exist in AI systems.
So some of them are not issues, but limitations. I want to emphasize two of them when it comes to understanding and performing knowledge work, since that is the subject of this panel. I think the first one is understanding the limits of the system and understanding, the context of work. Every day I open, my Twitter, I see these lists of jobs that will be replaced, and it seems that it's growing, and people are paying a lot of attention to these. Lawyers, you name it, marketers, digital content creators, and they use these broad statistical methods to understand how things happen at the macro level. I think that might be helpful, but looking at really the contextual dynamics of the work and whether AI can really, generative AI systems like ChatGPT-3 can understand those. For example, we know that, these systems have passed professional licensing exams. But yeah, and that is a telling moment. That is a watershedding moment for doctors, for lawyers. If I were in those professions, I would be concerned. But then the question is, how much of these apply to the real world situation, the clinical, context of, technology and the way that the doctors approach, their patients. There is a really interesting, I might send you the link, study by a doctor who did, it wasn't a academic study, but he was an ER doctor. He fed, the symptoms of their patients to the system and asked, ChatGPT-3 for differential diagnosis. In half of these examples, the system was plainly wrong, and the other half, it was providing, the correct, diagnosis. And the difference between these two piles exactly applies to the professional licensing exam, which are based on classic examples, where we have perfect information about the patient. Some of the doctor's job is eliciting information. The patient may show up, they do not know that they are pregnant, figuring out, and they may be completely unaware of it, but that changes the diagnosis. So knowledge workers will stay in the loop because of these, limitations of the systems like ChatGPT who do not understand the edge cases, the exception handling, and what we call the underground logic of practice, how people do things. The second thing I want to emphasize, I think Phaedra has a take there. She kind of touched upon it. These systems, we had this conversation with Thomas earlier. Inherent characteristic of these systems is they make things up. The effect that has been named hallucination in recent, conversations. They hallucinate, and the reason I would say this is inherent is like asking why humans, they have to eat within 24 hours because that's what makes us human. It's not something that can be immediately fixed. A lot of these really important generative capabilities of these systems come with these clear costs. Two of the major ones, I'm not going to touch upon opacity. The other one is just making things up. That has to do with the nature of these systems, which is about creating plausible text rather than true statement. So one way to understand these systems is like they are like smart children that parrot words and a statement that they overheard in adults' conversations. So they do not get the full context. They still understand some aspects of our conversation context. They are using NLP, models and systems, but meaning is much deeper. Meaning is much more contextual. And in some aspects, it has to be fact-driven based on empirical data. I'm sure all of you have seen instances of ChatGPT-3 making up references. And that's going to stay with us. That's going to be a problem for high-stake decision-making, like the medical conversations we talk about. And the final thing I want to touch upon is the concept of data provenance. In line with the last issue, it is not quite clear for the system itself where these pieces of information come together to generate a response. So data provenance has to do with the where these pieces come from. And I think that's going to stay as a big problem of these systems. And we need that if we want to create accountable systems that are accountable to our stakeholders. Phaedra, did you?
Oh, I think you said it beautifully, Mohammed. Truly, just to pile on, what large language models are really good at is predicting the next syntactically correct word. As Mohammed said, it doesn't understand the meaning of what you're actually requesting it. So not only are there concerns with respect to inaccuracies, but we're even seeing some companies annotating these inaccurate outputs as if it has proof, as if it has data lineage and provenance, when it doesn't have any. So in essence, it's annotating things which are totally factually incorrect, which is dangerous. And next, two other major concerns is that the outputs could absolutely be biased, as we talked about earlier. I mean, you could just ask ChatGPT, What are the top 10 most important or the best poets in the world? How many of those poets are going to be white men of Western European descent? And if you ask it a prompt that says, in your list, I'd like to see include women, non-Western European descent, it might give you a totally different list, but then you ask it the original prompt again, and it may not learn. So a question we have to ask ourselves is, whose worldview is being represented in artificial intelligence? We're talking about things like fairness, but whose definition of the word fair? Which is why I'm really glad that Professor Hofweber is here representing the School of Philosophy, because when we work with our clients, talking to them about things like, is it fair? Is it explainable? Is it robust? Is it transparent? Does it maintain people's data privacy? So getting them to elucidate, like, what is their worldview of fairness? What are their principles and values as an organization? How are they thinking about using AI to augment human intelligence? What's an experience like of a human once they've been augmented? So these are all considerations.
And Mark, I think as you're thinking about the limitations and the fact that, yeah, your meaning is not there. How do you, if as a knowledge worker, how do you think about the skills that you need to interact and kind of thrive in this new world with ChatGPT and with generative AI?
Yeah, and before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about kind of what the conversation has been. So, you know, there is bias in these systems. It gives you the wrong answers. I'm a big fan of memes, but so I saw one where it was iRobot, it's a robot talking to Will Smith in that movie, and he says, Will Smith was like, hey, how come he was asking the robot, why can't you be 100%, can you be 100% of the time correct and non-biased? And the robot says, no, can you? And that's kind of what, the reason these systems are like that is because we built them and we trained them, right? And that's where they get the data from. And so it's a fault of the system, but it's a reflection of the humans and the fact, what's being trained on, how they're built. In terms of the skills, I think if you look at what generative AI can do, I think one thing you do have to definitely check this stuff, right? But it can help you do a lot of things. It can help you, write emails, build meeting agendas, PowerPoint outlines, learn stuff, get advice basically. So, you could ask it like, and my business is losing money due to the high cost of sales. What would Jack Welch tell me to do? It'll pop out some answers, which are pretty reflective of what he thinks. Brainstorming. So I think it will, there was a report from Goldman Sachs that looked at, jobs, and it said about 2/3 of job occupations will be impacted anywhere from 25 to 50% roughly. And that percent of the task could be exposed to automation, which is both a downside and potentially an upside. It could help us increase GDP, but definitely the people in those occupations are going to have to do something. And so I think I think the way you got to think about it is AI is not going to replace you, right? Someone who knows how to use AI is going to replace you. So David Brooks had a good quote, what should you do? And he said, in the age of AI, major in being human. And so some of the key skills I would think you'd want to do, first off, you need to have fluency in generative AI. You need to play with these tools, understand these tools, figure out how you can be more productive and creative with them. There's really no end to the ways they can help you. You do have to check the output, of course. So you have to have some domain knowledge, or at a minimum, Google search the answers to make sure that they're actually, like the sources I hear exist, or this thing actually happened. Strategy and planning is something that humans do well. It can help you do that. Like give you a list of things you got to think about if you're running a project. I think a big part of it is the human part is interpersonal relationships and organizational awareness. So how do I, deal well with other humans? how do I sort out how to advance my projects and organizations? Your ability to synthesize information across boundaries. And a lot of these things are coming from a study McKinsey did of the impact of AI on skills. This was before generative AI, so some of those I would tweak a little bit. But your ability to synthesize information, also take information across boundaries, right? A lot of us are professionals in a specific area, but can you take what you know from one area and apply it to another? Or can you take information from another profession or another occupation or another field and apply it to your domain? So there's something I call cross-domain thinking, which I've written an article about, but basically ChatGPT can help you do this. So for example, if you were in the defense industry, what could ants, the nature of ants and the way they behave, what could that tell us about? How could that help me plan the US defense strategy? And it would give you a list of things that you can apply from this one area to another area. So, things like swarm defense, decentralized responsiveness. It kind of gives you a whole list of things. You can really do this with any type of, you take a concept, right, and then you apply it to the concept that you're interested in. So I think a lot of the things that we'll need to do are really going to be probably higher order thinking. Oh, the last thing I would add is resilience and adaptability, because I think things are going to, if this AI really increases innovation the way some folks like at OpenAI, people behind ChatGPT think it will, it's going to go like this. It's going to be a hockey stick of change, right? Mm-hmm. And so in that world, you're going to have to adapt a lot.
No, thank you, Mark. And I did want to say before I move on with my next question, we will have some time at the end to answer questions from the audience. So there's a Q&A function you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Feel free as you're listening, if questions pop up, feel free to put them in there and we'll take a look at those. But wanted to ask Thomas, it's in your class, as you're thinking about this with your students, in some ways it's twofold as far as how you have people who are going to be involved in actually building these models and making decisions about what data is going into these models. But and then the other is then now how do you get integration across an organization? And I know Mohammed and Phaedra, you'll likely have thoughts on this as well, but just how do you think about those two, I mean, it's very separate skill sets in a lot of ways. And yeah, how are you preparing your students for their involvement in those conversations, once they're moving out into the workforce?
You're addressing me first? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think what's important is to have a basic understanding on how the process works in generating the model. So, it's, when you start with some sort of data set, you can prepare that data set, you can clean it up in a certain way, you can remove certain biases at the beginning. That's one possibility. But so once you understand that, oh, okay, the model is just trained on this data through some sort of brute force mechanism with tons of computing power and tons of data, that what it outputs at the end without any sort of further fine tuning will just reflect on what comes from the data set. And so any sort of biases that exist will be perpetuated that way. So you need to either clean up the data or fine tune the result at the end. And so if you have a certain awareness, that what the sort of social implications of this whole process are, you can both mitigate them at the computer science level in how you build the model and how you prepare the data and how you fine tune afterwards and so on and so forth, as well as on the other side. If you employ one of those models, you got to be aware that there might be biases that are inherent in how it was constructed, because nobody spent the time to properly clean up the data or to properly fine tune to overcome certain biases. So I think that's how these two things can come together.
And yeah, Phaedra, maybe just talking about what that looks like in practice, within an organization, how you're making that happen.
Well, what we found more often than not is about 80% of investments in AI get stuck in proof of concept and never see the light of day. And more often than not, it's because either A, the investment was never directly tied to the business strategy at all, or B, people just don't trust the results of the model. So one of the first things that we do, we use design thinking heavily with clients, initially with the C-suite, to be talking about, like, what is your business strategy? Is this the right use case for AI, right? And then what are your principles as an organization? I mean, this is something that IBM published our own principles back in 2018. And it included things like, the purpose of AI is not meant to displace humans. It's meant to augment human intelligence. The second one is data and insights associated with those data belong to the creator alone, which is a statement about consent. And the third one is that our AI systems have to be both transparent as well as explainable. So working with, again, C-suite to determine what are your principles for use? Is this the right use case that matches with your business strategy? Then working with the technologists, the practitioners, to determine, do you even have the data ready? What's the level of maturity of your data to make this particular use case come alive? Then you bring in design thinking again. And the way that we use design thinking to determine things like, what are the unintended effects of this particular use case? Have you considered disparate impact for example, historically underrepresented groups? We tell our clients, we say, bring the most diverse group of people that you can get your hands on, not just gender, race, ethnicity, but in earnest worldview, neurodiverse, different socioeconomic status, right? In order to be thinking about what is the primary intent for this particular AI model, and then what are secondary and tertiary unintended effects, which of those could be potentially harmful. Then, given the values of your org, what are the rights of individuals? What are the rights either of your employees or whichever subjects they are that would, be interacting with the AI? And then how would you design in order to mitigate for that kind of harm? And I've got to tell you again, when thinking about education and skill sets and competencies, it's not what I've just described is not coding. People think 100% of the effort to develop AI is coding, when in fact, 70% of it is just picking the right data. So if you're assuming a definition of data is that it's an artifact of the human experience, and we humans are really biased, over 180 biases and counting, we desperately need people trained to ask these hard questions about data, like, was it gathered with consent? Is this representative? By the way, does this experience really augment human intelligence? You see what I'm saying? So that's why I'm pushing this narrative around multidisciplinary and making sure that we make more room for more seats at the table of who's developing AI, who's working on AI.
And Mohammed, if you can speak to the piece around just building trust, I mean, with people within the organization, of how does that happen? And then Mark, we'll make sure we
let Mark, I mean, because
yeah,
you're in time
okay,
crunch,
perfect. Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, sure. I just want to go back to Phaedra's principles, which I think were interesting. The purpose is not to displace individuals. Data should be collected with consent, so your content is protected. We should know how decisions should be arrived at. Is that pretty much what the three principles were, Phaedra?
I'll ping the link in the chat so folks can read it.
But that's close, right? Is that pretty close?
Yes.
Yeah.
Augment human intelligence, data and insights belong to their creator, and then AI systems have to be transparent and explainable.
Okay. So the interesting thing to me is that generative AI doesn't follow any of this. Those three things, right? That's trained on, a lot of the data have been scraped from places where the content, belonged to somebody else. We don't know quite how the answers come out. And it will displace individuals. So, it's just interesting that generative AI, those I think are three great and interesting principles, but they've all been pretty much violated by general.
Chelsea, there is a question in the chat. Would you want to answer those at the end or now?
Yeah, if you can speak to the trust piece a little bit, and then I was going to pivot to that is perfect.
Okay, so I think, going back to Phaedra has been trying to tell us, the placement narrative is not really helpful for two reasons. Number one is unethical. Number two is it's not feasible. When you really look deep down, it's not going to happen. So it's going to be an augmentation means partnership. We should partner with AI systems. And in my work, I look at the skills that we need to bring to those partnerships. One of the major skills is communication. And communication here means two different things. We need to be able to communicate with the machine. Us communicating with the machine. Now we've seen the emergence of this whole concept of prompt engineering. People who can actually get the ChatGPT 3 to give you the right answer, the answer that is helpful. The other part is, which has to do with the trust, is communicating AI-generated responses in the organization to different stakeholders, being able to embed them into organizational messages, connect them to the strategy. And that requires a lot of trust, and some of the problems already existing in these models, like I noted data provenance. Where did you get that? When you an expert, your partner gives you an answer, give you a solution, particularly if it's high stake. If it's Netflix giving you the right movie based on your preference, no one cares. That doesn't matter. But a lot of context, you really need to understand who was the person or people behind this. And I think explainable. AI community is developing these explainability engines. They're still very, very primitive. And they're still very difficult. This is still very hard to open up the black box of AI and understand how the process happened. And I think that's gonna be with us forever, because that's a very important inherent characteristics of deep learning systems. So for that reason, it is hard for trust issues, but also accountability and liability. Because if I, as a doctor, make a decision, I need to understand the full extent of it, and I should be able to justify it. So when you asked earlier the question, what are the skills that we need to develop in our students? One of the major ones is what I call AI literacy, being able to understand what is it that AI can do and what is it that it cannot do. That's how we develop a very good partnership with our partners, right? And being able to justify it, so one of the major ways that humans, our students in the future can be very helpful is what I call a knowledge scientist, explaining why certain things is provided by the system. And I mean, good luck with that. It's a very hard one.
Well, I think that feeds into one of the questions from the audience, just thinking about the fact that our political leaders have really struggled to understand technology more generally, and are often behind, and it's a reaction to negative outcomes. So, and Phaedra, this goes back to what you said about this right now, the values that are built into the decisions it's coming from Silicon Valley. So who is responsible for the impact that AI has, and how do we start to think about crafting a policy, a legal framework to deal with this as it changes so rapidly? Maybe if Thomas, if you want to kick that one off, and others can chime in.
Okay, so I mean, how to do it is a little unclear, I think, because there's a real tension. Because on the one hand, the companies that make these systems available, in particular, once they do it commercially, or more widely commercially, should be held accountable for the results. But on the other hand, everybody needs to understand that these systems are inherently flawed in a sense that, they're tied to probabilities in what their outputs are. They are trained on not the world and not how the world is perfectly, but on text and other things like that, and their outputs depend on that. And no matter how you work to overcome the that it gives you false answers and things like that, or hallucinations, that will never be fully resolved, I would imagine. So there's great potential benefit in having these models available, but there is also inherent flaws in them. And so I would imagine the legislator has to find some sort of balance between those things about how responsible the companies that make these models available should be in making them as trustworthy and truthful as they can. But on the other hand, the consumers have to understand that they can never be 100% correct all the time. And so you cannot hold, the companies accountable for every time there is some wrong answer or things like that. So I think it's a real balance. It's unclear where how to properly balance this out and what the right law would be. But I think the legislator definitely needs to take this up and make some proposal about that.
Any thoughts from, Phaedra or Mohammed?
I think there's an incredible opportunity now for educational institutions to reframe this conversation about who gets to be educated on this subject, right? As I mentioned, we need truly multidisciplinary teams working together, because it's not a technical problem. It's a socio-technical problem. So we desperately need a holistic approach. And I would even opine, even before higher ed, we can go even earlier into a student's career. For example, these design thinking frameworks that I described to you are absolutely exercises we have done successfully with high school kids and middle school kids. MIT released a fantastic curriculum on the subject of AI ethics for middle school kids. Like we just have to be thinking about it in this way. This isn't just a subject for people who self-categorize as coders or machine learning scientists. Those days are gone. And I think the reason why we're in the quandary we are in is that there's a very small, homogeneous group of people who've been the ones designing, developing, and deploying artificial intelligence. And it's why we need to change, again, who is working on this technology, to be thinking through, like, how is it going to be used? Whose worldview is being represented? And back to Mohammed's comments about things like data lineage and provenance, reinforcing to subjects, reinforcing to us end users, what are the kinds of questions we should be asking ourselves when we interface with an AI, including who's accountable for this? When was the last time this was audited? How accurate is this? How much better does it perform in comparison to a human? Was it audited for bias? Like, but we're not being trained to ask these questions in school. Why? Why haven't we done this? And that's what I desperately want us to change. With respect to the evolution of foundation models, large language models being an example of that, I think if enough of us push for things like transparency and explainability, we will absolutely see it. For example, I was at Mohammed, you'll like this. There's a big conference for libraries and librarians out in DC just a couple of weeks ago. And the whole subject was on artificial intelligence and the role of the librarian to do things like maintain ontologies that could be work in collaboration with large language models. So imagine, not to get too gorpy here, but the idea would be that if organizations could maintain a knowledge graph for content grounding, right? Here's where your ground truth is. You're using the large language model just to pipe out a number of different variations. But you always go back to the ontology to determine, or to tell the end user, here's the data lineage and provenance, here's where I got my information. So again, it's, how can we make a seat at the table for librarians? Why haven't they had a seat at the table to date? Who better to trust to determine which source of data is trusted do this thing, to power this particular use case?
Phaedra, did you see the last question in the chat?
I didn't. I haven't been paying
You
attention. Sorry.
beautifully answered that
You
question.
did.
Yes. I love it when that happens.
Well, and Mark, if you could speak to what is happening right now at UNC as far as what are there policies as far as use for students, who's kind of leading this effort, is, you know, what, and as Phaedra has said, does the university realize yet that what is coming from industry as far as what students need to be learning?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And if you look at most universities, only about 14% have actually put policies in place, and most of those deal with student use. I just had a chance to present to the deans and the provost last week on a proposal for a set of task forces or set of committees that would look at everything from student use all the way up to how does that change the UNC in higher ed's business model, all the way up to, you know, things like Thomas and Mohammed and Phaedra think about is like, what does this mean from society standpoint, right? So all the disciplines in the different parts of the university would be thinking about, what does this mean for medicine? What does this mean for government? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean for politics? And so I think they're very energized around that idea. I think, you know, I mean, to be honest with you, for the first thing that everyone wants to get their hands around is how do students use it, and how do we update courses? Because fundamentally, you know, there's lots of things that ChatGPT can do that will change the way we assess people, the way we teach people, the assignments we give. So I think there's a philosophy, it comes from this place called sentient syllabus. And the philosophy is AI should help you think, not think for you. And that's kind of the basic philosophy that I think we should use to approach this. And we need to think about the downside of it. You know, how do we keep students from misusing it, as well as ourselves misusing it, right? Can my chair, you know, do my performance plan on ChatGPT? Can, you know, write my evaluation on it? How could administrators use it? But then also the upside of it. So how do we get students, you know, to be digitally fluent, and, you know, understand both how to use it, but also what's behind it, right? I think the what's behind it is big, and then also figure out, you know, as these things, you know, take up over more and more of the cognitive skills, what are the skills that we should really be focusing on for them to learn? So, yeah, looks like Mohammed's got a point.
Yeah, I mean, because Susan asked this question in the chat, and Mark has been involved at the pan-campus level. My personal take on students' use and policy is students been cheating for centuries. This might be funny and might people take an issue with it. ChatGPT 3 brought equity to the cheating problem, because people used to pay, you know, I still pay these essay writing businesses fortunes to write essays for them. Now everyone has access to them. So I don't think, you know, I think we need to take a proactive approach, reactive approach to technology. Internet came along, you know, people got panic, you know, how that's going to change the landscape of homeworks and everything. I think that's the reaction, which is blocking it. Now, a bunch of school districts across the country have blocked, you know, ChatGPT 3 on there. That's very short-sighted, very short-term, you know, type of approach. There are people are still there. They started using it in their career. These students go to internship. Their colleagues are using it. So giving them the parameters and the guardrail and telling them this is ethical and, you know, but also like redesigning our assignments and everything. I'm not really worried about ChatGPT 3, any of my assignments, because my assignments are about reflection. ChatGPT 3 can help them to correct, like that's a huge help for international students or anyone whose first language is not English. But then the ChatGPT 3 cannot make stuff up about their personal life or an assignment, a scenario, or something that is very personal to them. So we need to really work around this because this is the future already happening. They're going to work with it. They're going to use it, whether we like it or dislike it. And developing, I'm a fan of minimal policies that do not, provide too much. But I think like any other technology, digital technology, with the exception of metaverse, it's going to stay here. The ChatGPT 3 is not going to go away. It's like the internet. And we need to come to the term with it in our institutions, in our businesses, and elsewhere.
I think there is an evolution. I mean, the examples that we've seen with ChatGPT have hoovered the internet. And I put some links in there so you can see, for example, how OpenAI hired Kenyan workers to remove toxic hate speech and imagery from the content that they were hoovering on the internet in order to create ChatGPT. But there's other examples of organizations using large language models with hyper curated data sets. So it's not that all large language models are going to be hoovering the internet in the same way that OpenAI did. So I think that's important to recognize, that there is going to be that kind of tuning of the data that is being used to curate those models.
Now, Mohammed, you said, it's equalized the cheating process. But the other angle, and obviously that, this goes against the kind of the mission or the what OpenAI they said was started for, is the democratization of AI. But now that you're monetizing these AI tools, are we starting to price people out? And this is the question from the audience, as far as it, should the government come in and ensure that there's some sort of free access, and kind of thinking about it almost as a public library? Is there a public version that is guaranteed to give people access?
I think some of it, a lot of it's already is open access, right? You can get Bing Chat, you can get Bard. They're not that great, I don't think. I think actually ChatGPT is of the three the better one. But I've got ChatGPT. I got it early, but I've rarely had times when I couldn't get on it, so I don't pay the $20 a month. So in a sense, it's there as long as you have a computer or even a smartphone, you have access to it. And libraries tend to have computers, so it's really pretty much, and a lot of people, throughout the different classes have computers, so it's there much better than many other tools. You may not have the ones, like you said, the best ones are ones that are specialized for certain things, but at least the general ones seem to be available now. We'll see what happens in the future, but.
Sorry, go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, I was going to say, so there's really so ChatGPT and the OpenAI models, like the later ones, are not widely available, but there's other companies, organizations that do make not just access to the model in the sense of interacting with it available, but the model itself. So for example, Hugging Face, you can download all kinds of data sets and models that they have pre-trained, and you can use those and things like that. So there is quite a bit available. There's also a lot of the software that you can use to train models is also freely available, like PyTorch and things like that. So it is actually all reasonably available. It's not that all the stuff is sort of hidden behind some proprietary paywall or something like that. So in some sense, there is a lot available, although, of course, the ones that we use the most now, like ChatGPT, is not available, nor is it for the latest version fully known precisely what these models look like and what precisely they're trained on and all these kind of things.
Another interesting question from the audience, and it looks like Phaedra, you might be taking a stab at it, and I think this is just reminds you, this is not limited. This is a question that the world is grappling with and choosing to answer it and respond to it in different ways. So what would you say to the argument, that slowing down these advancements for ethical concerns that this puts the US at a strategic disadvantage for, at looking at both your external and internal rivals and threats. How would you respond, Phaedra?
I know that there's been a letter that has been recently circulated. Maybe Wilton, that's what you're referring to. Elon Musk and others signed the letter, and then Timnit Gebru and others rebutted and said, "Hey, we've been talking about the ethical concerns." I think some of the things that concern me about the letter, in addition to what you're describing, is that they talked about one of their primary concerns being AGI, artificial intelligence becoming sentient. And what bothers me about that is I fear it is very much a distraction from some of the unique risks that we already talked about at the beginning of this call, inaccuracies, bias, whose worldview is being represented, blah, 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 blah. Instead of addressing these things that are happening now, saying, what about the Terminator? What about Skynet, right? So that concerns me. Additionally, I think the letter also omitted to talk about the environmental costs of these large language models, huge environmental cost. In order to train a brand spanking new large language model, it's the same amount of a carbon footprint as it does to power New York City for a month. I mean, you're not talking about a small amount. So that being said, though, there's no stopping the train, and it concerns me when I see larger groups saying we're going to ban, and we mentioned the schools already, we're going to ban the use of ChatGPT versus double downing our investment in teaching. Again, how should we be interfacing with AI? How should we be using it to augment our own human intelligence, to automate the things that can be automated so we can be better, or even better, like as Mohammed said, AI is a fantastic mirror for us to our own biases. Like, what can it tell us about our biases that we can then go and correct in our organizations?
I just want to chime in a little bit here, because I do spend, I've written a couple of books on strategy focused on Sun Tzu, who was an ancient Chinese military philosopher, and do follow a lot of geopolitics. But yeah, this is something I've been struggling with, and I think a lot of people have been struggling with. Even if you were able to put the hold on AI, you do have our, what people view as United States competitors, China, Russia, pushing ahead with these systems, including our allies pushing ahead with these systems. So I put a link in the chat called the Moloch Trap, which is, you kind of have to read the whole thing, but it's basically it's a game where, it's sort of like nuclear proliferation. Like, if everybody stopped and agreed to stop, that would be great, but everyone's incented not to stop, right? And so that's basically what's called the Moloch Trap. So yeah, I don't think there's any way we're going to be able to stop, given geopolitical considerations.
Thomas, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that. So there's really like two things in the ballpark here, in the air, and I think they're both really important, but they're quite different. One of them is this issue about bias and so on and so forth, and the other one is existential risk connected to the possible development of AGI. And I think the people who called for a halt were mostly concerned, as I understand it, with the second one. And I think that is something that really needs to be kept in mind and taken seriously as well, besides the bias. So these are both, I think, really important topics. Because if it's really true that in the near future there might be an artificial general intelligence that has access to all this information, it could lead to consequences that are an existential risk for humanity. And so I think this sort of slightly long-termish vision about, well, maybe in 20 years, this will really come about, is something that is, and so, like, we don't really know how to mitigate that kind of risk yet. So if the models become too powerful, too large, this is something that I think should be taken seriously. So in any case, I'm not, a halt in development might be too much, but certainly further investment in AI safety would be a really good idea as well.
wanted to quickly address David Knowles' question about regulation by pointing out the EU AI Act proposal, which I put in the chat so you can take a peek. There are parts of the world that have established regulation on what are high-risk models. New York City in particular released some time ago regulation around automation with respect to how it's being used within HR. But some concerns that I have, not only with respect to do our legislators actually understand this space and some of the unique risks, but also is there enough teeth? Like, for example, with the EU AI Act, they very much are looking towards the organizations themselves to self-police in effect. It's not like they've stood up a third-party evaluator or assessor to do that kind of auditing. So that's, again, something else that I think we need to all keep watchful of.
No, thank you, Phaedra. Well, we are at time, and just want to thank our panelists for joining us today. I will follow up with a link to the recording as well as any of the links that were included in the chat. So feel free to share. And we will, at the Kenan Institute, we're going to be continuously thinking about this. So encourage you to stay connected with us as we do future webinars like this and commentaries and insights. But this was such a great discussion. Thank you all for joining us, and wish everyone a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.